In sections 2 and 3 of this chapter, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is broken down into two different types of reactions. You have the light-dependent reactions, and then you have the light-independent reactions. So, first talking about photosynthesis itself. So photosynthesis takes place in organisms which are known as producers. So these organisms can make their own source of chemical energy. So, sure you're all familiar with it. It's mostly plants. Some algae can do this, and a couple odd creatures out there can also do this. So photosynthesis is the process of capturing energy from sunlight to make sugars or carbohydrates, mostly glucose. So photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. Now, when we look at the chloroplast, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on inside of the organelle, right? So chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, which gives it the green color. There are actually several different types of chlorophyll, and the green ones actually absorb everything but green light, and then they will actually die off the earliest. Okay, so if we're talking about fall when the leaves change color, they change color because the green chlorophyll has kind of lost its color. Okay, it's not really active anymore. And so then you see the other types of chlorophyll that are red or orange or yellow or brown or anything like that. Okay, those don't absorb as much energy, which is why they're not the dominant ones. And then they reflect, they absorb everything but the color that they reflect. So like red chlorophyll absorbs everything but red light, so on and so forth. Okay? So that's where you get your different leaf colors in the fall. Chlorophyll is a molecule that absorbs light energy, and it also gives leaves their colors. So, photosynthesis takes place in two parts of the chloroplast. So when we look at the chloroplast, it really just looks like you've got kind of a bean with a lot of empty space on the inside, and then you have these little stacks of pancake-looking things. Okay, but it's all green. So you have the grana, are the stacks of the pancakes. Okay, each individual pancake is called a thylakoid. Okay, and then surrounding that, you have something like a cytoplasm type material, but in this case it's called the stroma. So you have the grana and the stroma. Grana is made up of the thylakoids. Okay. Now, each thylakoid has its own membrane. So it is a membrane-bound sac inside of the chloroplast. So this is where the dual cell membrane comes in. Okay. So chloroplasts have two different cell membranes. They don't use their outer cell membrane all that much for these reactions, but they do use the thylakoid membrane a lot. Okay, so getting into the two types of reactions for photosynthesis. So first up, you have your light-dependent reactions. So the light-dependent reactions are really just there to capture as much energy from sunlight as possible. Okay, so they will take in as much energy as they can, and then they will pass that energy along to the light-independent reactions. So the light-independent reactions actually make the sugars. They make the glucose or whatever other sugar is going to be made. We're just going to focus on glucose. So the light-dependent reactions actually take place in the thylakoid. Okay, so this is where that thylakoid membrane comes into play, because a lot of this is actually taking place across that membrane. Okay, so there's a lot that gets pushed into the membrane, and then there's also some significance to what gets passed through the membrane. So water and sunlight are needed at this point in the light-dependent reactions. Sunlight is kind of obvious because it's dependent on the light. And then the chlorophyll will absorb the energy from the sunlight, and then it will transfer that energy along the thylakoid membrane and into the light-independent reactions. And then at this point, this is also where you get oxygen released. So when you think about photosynthesis, you think about it using water, using sunlight, and using oxygen. Okay, so here we have all three of those being used. Water, sunlight, and oxygen. Water, sunlight, and then releasing oxygen. The other thing that gets used is your carbon dioxide. So that will be along in the light-independent reactions. Okay, so this is looking more at the light-dependent reactions, how they take place. So you have the sunlight bringing energy into the thylakoid membrane. Okay, and then you also have water that's brought into the thylakoid membrane. It is split, which we'll get into in a little bit, and then oxygen is released from this. Okay, so you need 2 water molecules in order to release 1 oxygen molecule. All right, so we'll see where the numbers and all of that come in later, but and then also you're going to be producing energy-carrying molecules, including ATP, which are going to transfer the energy from the light-dependent reactions into the light-independent reactions. So the light-independent reactions take place in the stroma, so in that space around the thylakoid stacks, the grana. They need carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so this is where your third reactant comes in. Okay, so we've already seen the water and the sunlight, and now we get our carbon dioxide. Okay, and then we've already seen one of our products being produced, the oxygen, and we're still going to need to see where the sugar comes out. So it uses the energy from the light-dependent reactions to build a sugar in a cycle of chemical reactions. And it is a cycle, so it is going to be cyclical in nature, and we're going to basically produce the reactants out of this cycle. Okay, we'll get into that later. So in the light-independent reactions, again, it takes place in the stroma, so basically in the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. And here you'll see your carbon dioxide coming in, okay, and those carbon dioxides are used to build sugars. So you need 6 carbon dioxides to come in because you need those 6 carbons to build the 6-carbon sugar. Okay, and that 6-carbon sugar is going to be one of your products. Okay, oftentimes those sugars can then be used to create starches or cellulose just by binding it all together. Okay, so your overall reaction, you have 6 carbon dioxides coming into the light-independent reactions, and then you have 6 water molecules coming into the light-dependent reactions. And then out of the light-dependent reactions, you're going to get the 6 oxygens coming out. And then out of the light-independent reactions, you're going to get the 1 molecule of sugar, the C6H12O6. Okay, so this is looking at it all together. So in the light-dependent reactions, you're going to have sunlight coming in, passing energy off into the thylakoid membrane. Thylakoid membrane is also going to take hydrogens from water molecules and release oxygen. And then it will use the energy from the sunlight and the hydrogens to produce energy, which will then be passed into the stroma, where the light-independent reactions take place. Those will use the energy from the light-dependent reactions and the carbon dioxide to produce a 6-carbon sugar. And voila! That is photosynthesis in a nutshell. Okay, so this is basically how you can say this reaction out loud. 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules yield 1 glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. Alright, so now we're going to focus in more on the light-dependent reactions. Okay, so light-dependent reactions include groups of molecules called photosystems. Okay, so photosystems are found within the thylakoid membrane. Okay. And it's really nice and confusing because they discovered photosystem 1 first, but the energy is actually captured by photosystem 2 before it gets passed on to photosystem 1. So of course, instead of, renaming them to make sense, they just kept it as photosystem 2 and then photosystem 1. So photosystem 2 comes first in this whole thing. It captures the initial energy from the sun and then transfers that along. So it captures it using chlorophyll. So chlorophyll will absorb energy from sunlight, and then that will be used to energize electrons that enter the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is just a fancy way of saying electrons get passed into a membrane and then passed along it. Okay, so it's a really fancy way of just saying that. Water molecules do get split at this point. The oxygen from the water molecules is released as a waste product of photosynthesis. And then the hydrogen ions from the water are transported across the thylakoid membrane. So they're going inside of the thylakoid at that point. So we're going to look at this a little bit closer here. Okay, so photosystem 2 builds up charged electrons inside the thylakoid membrane, and it also pumps hydrogen ions into the thylakoid, creating a positive charge inside the membrane. Okay, so we're going to go through this step by step. Okay, first step, in photosystem 2, you have energy from sunlight is absorbed by photosystem 2. Okay, so it's absorbed by the chloroplasts. Okay, these chloroplasts then pass this energy into electrons that are pushed into the membrane. Okay, so these electrons actually come from water molecules. So when you break down the water molecules, you have basically half an oxygen or half an O2 molecule. So you have an oxygen atom released. Then you have 2 hydrogen molecules released. And breaking down this water, they also strip the electrons off of these hydrogens. So you have 2 hydrogens, which both have a positive charge on them now, and 2 electrons, which obviously have a negative charge. Those electrons are the ones that get pushed into the membrane, and they absorb the energy that's passed to them from the chloroplasts, okay? Or the chlorophyll, sorry. So, now you've got electrons, which are relatively excited inside of the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so you can see here the electrons were picking up energy from the chlorophyll, which had absorbed it from the sunlight, and then they get passed into the membrane, into the electron transport chain. And then you also have these hydrogens sitting across here. So the hydrogens will use some of the energy from these electrons in order to push themselves across the membrane. Okay, so they get transported across the thylakoid membrane, which means that you have now less energized electrons in the membrane, but you also have hydrogen molecules being built up inside of the membrane. Okay, so this is an active transport here. You're using energy to transport an ion across the membrane against its concentration gradient. Okay, so that is taking up a lot of energy. It's actually storing a lot of energy to keep all of those hydrogen molecules together. Okay, all of those hydrogen ions, all those little positive charges. It's taking a lot of energy to keep them together inside the thylakoid. Okay, so at this point, all of this kind of gets pushed off into photosystem 1. Okay, so photosystem 1 is going to capture more energy from the sun and then produce energy-carrying molecules. Okay, so right now you have some kind of decharged electrons hanging out in the membrane, and you also have the positive hydrogen ions hanging out inside the membrane. Okay, and you've already released some oxygen. So this is kind of where you're sitting right now. And we're actually going to pause here and then pick up in the next video.